All right. Any questions so far, milestone 2 or anything before I get started with today's topics? Okay, I will take that as a no. So we're going to be starting our second unit actually today, and we've done some very simple web development, but now we want to make things more complicated, make things more interactive, and overall just more interesting. So we're going to be talking about JavaScript. You will get a very crash course, emphasis on crash with how to use it. And then I'm going to introduce you guys to React. You're not going to do much coding with it, but we're just going to go over like some motivations for it. So let's start off with why we care. So far, we've been using Python and the Flask framework on our backend. But why do you think that we should learn JavaScript? I'm, and a second follow-up question is, I'm not going to be teaching specific languages, as I've said before, but why am I going to give you a crash course in JavaScript? Rainfist said front end. Yeah, we haven't really done front end languages. JavaScript is probably the main front end language. Sometimes another language is better for the job. Yeah, that's really good, Jessica. So we always want to be evaluating different technologies that we can use. There's never one answer, and there's never a single tool that we use for a given app. So eventually, if it's a good enough app, we're going to need multiple tools in order to make it more complicated. Ian, is JS faster than Python? I actually don't know the specifics with that. My gut answer is yes, but that's a consideration to make. And I think you can use JS on the server to replace Python if you want that. Yeah, so like Jessica was saying, you needed to determine like what languages are best suited for our job or our web app. Often JavaScript should be on your list. So you should be thinking about it, even if you're not using it, because a lot of times you're going to need it. Especially if you're doing web development, you should know how to read and debug JavaScript because you're going to end up getting thrown some JS files at some point in your life. And the reason why I'm going to give a quick crash course is just because JavaScript is a weird language, probably not what you're used to with like Python and Java. And I just want to show you like the quirks with it, basically. So when we're doing project one right now, what do you guys think it's mainly focused on? Are we working on the back end or the front end or like half and half? Do you feel like we're leaning one way or the other? Andre and Krupesh said front end. Jessica said front end. Feels mostly front end. Ian said back end. Christian said leaning back. Michael too. Oscar back end. Gavin front. Paul full. Okay, yeah. Really getting the full spectrum of answers, which is interesting. I see why you guys would say both, honestly. But okay, I'm seeing more fulls, some back end, some front end. Ivana said back. Okay, yeah. Well, the answer actually is we've been doing mainly back end work, even though it feels like we're doing a lot of front end and we're doing like HTML and CSS changes. Those are on the front end, but a lot of like the kind of the heavy lifting right now is being done by the server actually, and the server is the back end. So a lot of the heavy lifting is being done in Flask or like in Python, because Flask is where we're making our API calls to fetch data. It's where we're actually returning the front end material. So we're actually creating our templates and then sending them down from the back end to the front end. So we're not actually doing too much client side work. Like obviously we're making these changes to like the style and stuff that does front end things, but most of the code that we have is actually Python related. So So far, like basically what we've been doing is we have a Python web server and it's returning a response. And once it returns that response, that HTML page that the user can see, we're not really doing anything further. So there's no interaction from the user side back to the server. We're not being able to take in anything that the user, might want to click or search or do something like that, and using that information to give another response on the back end. So this is a really limiting design. And usually when we're talking about clients and servers or like the front end and back end, then you want both of them doing work. And that's how you make things more interactive. So I've heard some ideas like in office hours, but like, are there things you guys have wanted to do in project one to make your app more interactive, but you felt like you don't really know how? Yes, like what kinds of things have you wanted to do? One example is like search for a given artist or something. Okay, yeah, Christian literally said what I did. Animation, Rainfist, yeah. Collapsing the player, so that's like some more animation too. Making your own player, okay, so not using the default. Pranavi said also searching for an artist. So these are all things that you can use JavaScript more for. Krupesh said get every artist instead of picking 3 to 5. Okay. Anything else? Yeah. So in general, a lot of times, like whenever you want something from the user, then you're going to need JavaScript in order to kind of get that information and access it. Whenever you want like things to move around and do things with a certain logic, so like animations or collapsing, things like that, those are a lot harder in just plain CSS or HTML. I mean, it's impossible with plain HTML and it's harder with CSS on its own. That's where JavaScript becomes really useful. You can make things interactive. So how does it actually run? Basically, similar to CSS, we would send down these static files from the web server. So we would define our style.css in static, and then we would have a link to it in the HTML page. And when you return that HTML down, then your browser basically fetches that CSS file from our server. Similarly to CSS, JavaScript is also going to be in that static folder. And when you send down your HTML page, there's going to be another one of those link type things that tells your browser to go fetch all your JavaScript code. So that's kind of how it gets run. And then JavaScript is mainly something that's run by the browser in the browser's environment. It doesn't always have to be, but that's what we're focusing on right now. So basically, you can send down specific code that you want the browser to execute at like different parts in the web page. So when I click a button, or when I search something, or when I try to like expand the audio player, things like that. And once they have that huge file of code, then they can decide based on your logic when to do what and what to do. So things get a lot more interesting with it. And yeah, I basically said this, but your static files that the browser is requesting include the images, the CSS files, the JavaScript files. So some syntax stuff with JavaScript. It is also, it's kind of standardized by something called this ECMA script, ECMA script, I don't know how to say it. And the currently used version is called ES6. Whenever you're Googling, like, how do I do this in JavaScript, always look out for something with ES6, because that's kind of using the most modern syntax. There's a lot more functionality provided by that. And it uses like the curly braces similar to what you've seen in Java or C++. You don't need indentation like Python. It's just for your own sanity. So you won't get errors if you don't indent properly. But if you have like if statements, else statements, functions, you need those opening and closing curly black brackets for all those. Yeah, Ian, you can do that. And actually, when you see like bundled versions of JavaScript, which we'll go to, that are optimized for the browser, then usually they're just going to like squish everything into one big line, because each extra space that you add in your file is making that file a larger like file size. So that's more to download. So it's one way to optimize. And other thing is semicolons are required. So similar to Java, you end every sentence in your code with a semicolon. And your browser will try to like put them in the right spot. It's very forgiving with it, but it's not always right. So don't rely on that. Okay, so the type system. You've probably heard people shitting on JavaScript a lot. Like I feel like it's probably the most hated language in general. Like that's commonly used, at least, just because it has a very like weak type system, and confusing type system. So people who like more structured languages like Java and things like that, and even Python, they get really annoyed by the way JavaScript is run. Kevin, same boat. Yeah. Luckily, there's some things that allow you to type them. So at Facebook, we use something called Flow, where you basically have to type all your variables. Even though it's not native to JavaScript, it's kind of a library on top of it. There's also TypeScript here, like Michael said. Yeah. So in Python, you don't have to like declare types anywhere, but it is still like strongly typed. So yeah, but unlike that, in JavaScript, the browser kind of, again, it's very forgiving with types, and it's not really trying its best to keep them separate. So if you see this example here, the number one plus the string a plus this array plus this object, that is a valid thing you can do in JavaScript. It's not going to throw any errors, and it's basically going to combine everything into like its string form, in some way, in some weird way. So you kind of have to pay attention on your own and be careful with it. But again, luckily there's tools that help you with that, that you're going to use at most companies. Okay, so weird stuff with JavaScript. And actually, as a disclaimer, I actually love JavaScript. I probably code with it every day at Facebook. I use it the most. And once you like understand it well, it's like I don't love it as a language, but I love all the stuff you can do with it. So once you know how to use JavaScript well, it is very empowering when you're a web developer, because you can just do so much more. And there's really no limits, in how interactive you can make a page. So here's some weird stuff. There's 3 ways to declare a variable. You're going to have let, you're going to have const, and you're going to have var. I usually use const. That's kind of one of the better practices when you can. And it's basically saying, once I've defined my string here, I can't reassign my variable. So I can't say later on, I want to change my other string to like my name. You can't do that. And that can be beneficial because it could help you avoid bugs in the future. Like maybe you accidentally reassign something, and you didn't want to, if you're like using the same variable name or something. So it can help you there. The other one is let my string here equals hello. That is a way you can assign a variable and then reassign it later on. So obviously those cases come up. And the benefit of let is that it is kind of restricted to a block of code. So if you define let in like a for loop to track your index, then you're not going to be able to use that or access that variable outside of the for loop, which is good, because if you have like 2 for loops, You don't need to do like let I, let J, let K in each one. You could keep doing let I in every single one as long as they're separate blocks of code. So again, you'll figure this out as you go, but I just want to show you that there's 3 ways to do it. The first 2 are my recommended ways based on what you need. Okay, more weird stuff. So there are different ways to define functions, and you are going to see this really often. So here are like the 3 ways that you'll probably see most often. The first one is probably what you will see in like similar to Java. You say function, so that's like your keyword that you're declaring. Then you have add, which is the name of your function. You're going to take in your arguments in the parentheses, and then you use your curly brackets to put whatever code you want in your function. So here it's adding those arguments together. You can also assign a function to a variable though. So this is kind of another way to do it. If you remember, when you create a variable, you can use const. So const and then add is my variable name. And then I'm making it equal to a function of the same way. And then finally, in the latest kind of syntax, you can actually do like a shorthand function. And these are often called inline functions. So I don't have to actually name it in any way. And this can be useful when I don't really care like to save it as a variable or use it later. I just want to use it inside of another function. So how do you call the third option? That is a good question. Because it doesn't have a name put with it, it's not going to be used to actually like make a call per se in your own code. What you're going to be doing is like maybe you need to pass in a function as an argument. Then you would be able to pass in this line of code as an argument instead of having to like define it as a variable. And the reason I'm telling you this, because it might seem like it's actually more messy and painful to do this, but this is how a lot of JavaScript developers do it. So they might pass into a function, like in this add function, another function as an argument, which could get messier. Kevin, same as inline if statements in JavaScript or what? I'm sure you're right. Oh, in C, okay. Yeah, good to know. Could you store the function in a variable? Yeah, Jessica. So you actually could. So that's a good point. If you see the second one where I do const add equals, instead of that longer function, you could use the shorthand and do it in the same way. So I could do const add. So what I just put in the chat, you could do that, and that is another valid way to assign the shorthand to a variable. Okay, and Kevin, I actually don't know the context of it, but I trust you. I think that might be true. We can look it up later. Okay, so here is one more thing. This is just like equality between values in JavaScript. There is some weird stuff going on here. So in the first example, this is what you would expect. So hello world equals hello world. These strings are the exact same kind of value. So this will show up as true. Next one, if you do 77 equals with 3 equal signs equals the string 77, then that's going to be false. So usually when you're dealing with equality, you want to make sure the value is the same and the type is the same. So here, that's not the case. You're doing a number version versus a string version. But there's a difference between using 3 equal signs and 2 equal signs. If you use 2 equal signs, then it's a little bit more forgiving. And it's kind of seeing, is it weakly equal to one another? So here, 77 actually does equal the string 77 because it's going to try to force the types to become the same. and maybe like cast the string into a number, therefore making them equal. And then in the last case here, false does not equal to 0 when you use 3 equal signs. That makes sense because they're just completely different values, different types. But if you use 2 equal signs, then false actually does equal to 0 because both are considered what we call falsy. So a 0 is a falsy number, just because that's the way they say it. So if you did 1, then that's not falsy. That's actually true if you think of it in like a binary sense. The TLDR though for this is use 3 equal signs because you're going to be getting the result that you're expecting, versus when you do 2, like you might be used to in Python, then there might be some weird shit going on. Any questions so far with the syntax? Okay. All right. So we are shifting a little to more on like the web page and browser side of things. Something that we didn't talk about when we went over HTML is this concept of a DOM, or a document object model. So when you're looking at an HTML page, your browser is actually storing it in a sort of data structure called the DOM. And this is basically storing the hierarchy of all the elements that you're displaying in your HTML. So if you see here, if you remember that sort of like skeleton or like anatomy of an HTML page, you would have like the HTML root element, the head, the body, and then in body, you could have all the different tags you're adding, like your divs and your headers and your links and things like that. And each one of those might have children nested within them. And this tree kind of grows further and further and further. Can anybody think of why this can be useful to store it as a tree? And you can just guess here. You don't need to know. Abhishek said changing things using JavaScript. So yeah, it could be a more systematic process if you want to change something. Maybe you want to like change the text of your link at the very bottom of this tree. Then you kind of know how to traverse it using algorithms that you may know. Michael said it's intuitive. Yeah, so by nature, this document or this kind of HTML page is it's hierarchical, and you have parents and children. So it's just kind of intuitive to do it. Hussein said easy to track. So it can be easier, yeah, it can be easy to track like how many children a given element has. You can see like how many levels deeper does it go, things like that. So these are all just ways that the browser can then optimize making changes to the HTML in code. And how would you make those changes in code? The browser basically exposes this API called the DOM API, which you can use in your JavaScript functions when you're working in a browser. So you're going to have access to these objects called window and document. And those are going to have like a bunch of useful methods that you can use to access different parts of the DOM. So when we were talking about wanting to like, I don't know, change something or like move things around or see if the user clicked a button, things like that, then you need to somehow know or like talk to those HTML elements that you're dealing with. So the way you can do that is with these functions in JavaScript. I put 2 examples here. You have get element by ID, which basically says, if you remember, you can set a class name or a ID attribute to your elements. So my link could have an ID to it that here I'm calling my link ID. And then what you could do is you could actually grab that link element as a variable. So in the second line in the example, I'm saying const link equals, and then I'm using get element by ID. And I'm just passing in the ID that I gave it in HTML as the argument. So when I do that, it's returning me basically a data structure for that specific link. And then once I have that data structure, I can make updates to it. So say I want to, in my code logic, change the link from google.com to youtube.com. Then you could actually do that by saying link.href. So by setting the property in this link object to a new value, which is youtube.com. And when you do that, then on the actual HTML page that the user is seeing, the link would have changed. So this is where you can see like how you can add some sort of logic where as the user is interacting, clicking things, scrolling, doing whatever they want on the web page, you can then track those and make changes to the web page. So this is how it becomes interactive. And we're going to practice this we're going to practice this now. Any questions before we keep going? Okay. All right. So now I'm not going to actually play a demo at the same time, like while we're watching. I don't want us to all watch together. I want you guys to kind of work on a set of steps that I've written out on your own. So I feel that if you were kind of actively reading and coding this on your own pace, then you might understand this better and it might sink in better than the video for this topic at least. So I'm going to give you all 25 minutes. You are going to go to Canvas. You're going to go to homework 8 and your assignments. And there's going to be a link to instructions. And I want you all to basically in your own Cloud9, get as far as you can in these steps. So go at your own pace. I have links provided if you want to like read more about them. And then obviously I'm right here. So we can talk about some questions or confusions you have as you're doing it. Okay, so 25 minutes, let's see, 9:33, which means 9:58. We will continue on. Hopefully you guys can access everything. Let me know if you can't. If anybody's getting a key error when they're trying to run the app, then make sure that you put your own personal key in the environment file. Yep. And everyone, remember to ask me questions if you're getting stuck. I'm sure other people are running into the same issues. Krupesh, here's what the pop-up should look like. If you're seeing my screen, I do alert, hello. Then this is the pop-up. And you would have to click OK to get out of it. Andre, should you put everything in window.onload? So that's a good question. Whenever you're dealing with elements on the page, then you do need that function because you have to load those elements. If you don't need to use the elements on the page, then you don't need that function. Oh, you didn't see the pop-up? Let me try it one more time. Maybe it's not showing up on screen share. Do you see it now? No? Oh, okay. Here, I'll take a picture of it. Yeah, it's a small rectangle at the top of the page. Ian, you asked how can you print the user text? So basically, you are just passing in a variable instead of a string itself. So if I have my string here, and then you want to show that actual variable, then you could do alert my string instead of text inside of it. Yeah, so if you wanted to do, you can concatenate with the plus. So I could do my string plus num1, and then that'll show up as the concatenated string. Ivana, yeah, you can do everything in the branch, this whole homework. Anoop, it's just logging whenever you click the button. It's not actually counting anything. So there's no logic for that yet. Oh yeah. Yeah. So DevTools is gonna show you how many times something was logged instead of repeatedly printing it out every time. This can help with spam if something is getting logged like 1,000 times. And yes, you can totally use JavaScript in Milestone too. I'm not expecting it because we're covering it so close to the deadline. But if you want to use it for extra credit and make some cool interactions, then you should. Kevin, make sure that your key hasn't changed on your developer account. You shouldn't need the secret, Kevin. Just the main key should be enough. I'm giving you guys 2 more minutes and then we are going to keep going. It's okay if you're not done. The rest is homework. Andre, app.root is basically just creating a new endpoint on your server. And that endpoint is called search, and it's taking in a variable that can change, which is your user text. It's not going to actually do anything on the client. It's just accepting some data in the form of that variable. Rainfizz, not getting it to print for which step? Uncaught syntax error. Okay, I'll have to try this just to make sure that I didn't put any syntax errors in my code. But make sure that you copied it exactly the same. Okay. So again, it's fine if you weren't supposed to finish all of this right now. I just wanted you to get started and start working on it. You're gonna have more time like after class to do it on your own. So you can ask questions then too. But so come back to Zoom, everybody, and we are going to start the next part. What I want us to do now is to basically, I'm going to open up breakout rooms of three-ish people. And I'm going to give you the chance to, one, introduce yourselves. So just like say your name and like the last TV show you watched, if you liked it or not. And then I want you to share one thing that you're confused about from homework 8 so far. And hopefully, if some of you know it, then you can help each other out with those confusions. If nobody knows the answers, then you can Google them together and come back to me after the session. So again, you're going to introduce yourselves, and then you are going to talk about one thing you're confused about. And Oscar, I know it's hard, but now we are taking a break from that. So please do come back. All right. So here we go. I'm going to open these up. And hopefully you guys can help each other out on anything that you're stuck on at the moment. All right, I'm opening them. Gavin, Glorian, Yezin, go ahead and join. Hey, Mihir.
Hello.
It looks like you're in the room by yourself, so I just came to talk to you.
Oh, okay. No,
Or if
I'm
you
just
want,
fine.
I can put you in another room. What do you prefer?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay,
Yeah.
let me do that. All right, I'm gonna move you into one of the rooms.
Okay.
All right, how was that?
I found out that it's not only me having the issues with search thing.
Oh, good. Okay, who was that? Paul?
Yeah.
Other people are having issues with what were you
Uh,
trying?
So we're getting the error where it says undefined. Sorry, give me a second. Uncaught type error.
Uncaught. Okay. Okay.
And it's null. That's the issue that we're having.
Okay. Well, we can talk about that. I think one key thing is, where are you putting that code?
In the body.
So this code here, you're putting in the body of the,
Oh, sorry. No, that the Java go up a bit.
yep.
So where it says constant user text. That's on that line on the JavaScript file.
Mhm.
It's giving me back a error when I look at the debug console.
Okay. And what's the error saying? Something's null.
Uncaught type error. Document get element by ID is null.
Okay. Document. Okay. So that's something you can try Googling, but what it sounds like is this value here that's being returned is null. And where are you putting this line of code?
The one you highlighted right now
Yes.
and the .js file.
Okay. So one thing to do is, you have to be putting it in the right place. The reason that we have window.onload is because it's not going to be able to find the content unless you have it within this function. That's first making sure that everything is loaded up on the HTML page.
Okay.
So that's one thing. And then another thing to think about is, when do we actually need to get this variable? So we only want to do it once the user types in text and then clicks the button to submit. So that means we actually want to have it inside of the function that's handling a certain event. So in this case, like only after a user has clicked, then we want to do some stuff. And that stuff is actually like getting the text from the input and then doing stuff with it. So my suggestion, if you're getting that error, is to try to make sure that you have it in the right place and think about where you can put it within this code here. So
you.
we can talk about it more after class if people are still confused. And also make sure the element is the same. So the element ID is the same as what you've put in your actual input element. So here I just put input ID, but you have to make sure that you assign the ID to the element in step 1, and then you're actually accessing it correctly. So 2 things to think about for those of you who are having those sorts of errors.
Yeah, that was there. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Oscar, you were having that. Giovanni, having an issue with fetch. There might be an issue actually that I should have written window.fetch. I don't know if that was the error, but that's something that you can try Googling and see if you get solutions for. So try Googling like fetch not defined and see what you get with that. And my initial thought is you might need to access fetch from within the window object, that global window object that you have access to. Okay, cool. So again, you might run into errors. The key is find the error on your dev tools and then Google the error and see the Stack Overflow posts. And hopefully you're going to find something through that. All right, so I think that will be a good homework. Once you guys are all done, you will have kind of an end-to-end understanding of how you can use JavaScript to take in user data and also pass that user data to some server or some backend where you can do some, some processing with it. And that's how you really start to build that true client server architecture in an app. But again, you can always ask questions in Slack and you can ask after class. We don't have a lot of time, like 5 minutes, but I wanted to quickly go over React and like kind of a motivation for it before we start coding in React next class. So React is basically a library / framework that was created by Facebook in like 2011. It's really taken off since then in like the last 10 years and become the de facto like standard that's used across a lot of modern companies today for building UIs. So I, of course, at Facebook, that's like everything we use. I use React every day. And most of the JavaScript that I'm writing is within or like using React libraries. The basic goal of why we use React is to make creating interfaces easier. And you can do this on the web, on mobile. They have like React Native. So they have different ways that you can use their library on different devices. And React is going to be based on what we call components, which are kind of these self-contained pieces of code that define a part of your app that you can combine and reuse to create like a larger user interface. And one cool thing about React is that it's using the syntax called JSX. So JSX basically combines your normal JavaScript syntax with your kind of like HTML, XML syntax. So you can actually directly in your JavaScript code use what you see here in the green, use this sort of these like tags, this sort of HTML syntax to create elements and like pass them down. So rather than needing to like write out a full HTML string or something, which you're going to see in your homework in the last steps, you can actually just define these elements directly in your JavaScript code and return them in your functions. The kind of the alternative, if you weren't using JSX, is what you see here in the orange, where you would have to use some kind of level of APIs and like functions to create your header element here and then pass in like your children. So then create like your H1 element inside with the text that you want. So that's obviously not as intuitive as simply just writing out the hierarchy as you're used to when you write HTML. And then the beauty of what you're going to see here is that because this is tied into your JavaScript code, you don't need you can have like more complicated logic in like what content you want to display. So as an example, I could have a variable and then pass that in as the content that I want inside of my H1 tag. So it's no longer, it doesn't have to be static. Maybe my variable is being defined by something on the server, some data I'm getting back. Or maybe it's being defined by some if statements that I have, some logic that I'm writing. So you can start adding more and more code that defines the content that you see. And this might actually remind you of the syntax that we were using in Jinja with Flask. So you see these curly brackets here to show the variable my title. That is exactly what we're doing in Jinja, but just like with double curly brackets. So it's a very similar concept here in order to show like dynamic variables from JavaScript. And this is kind of going to be like the base unit of what you do in React, which is called a component. And a component is just going to be a function that you write that returns some sort of HTML, or like in this case, JSX. So in this case, I'm just taking everything that I showed in the last slide, and I'm making a component called header. That's just the name of the function. And it's going to have all the logic that I wanted kind of encapsulated in here. So that is a very quick primer. We're not going to talk much about it until next class. But one final thing I'm going to talk about, because it's related to your homework, is there's something called Create React App, which is this sort of like package or like tool that you can install and then run. And what it's going to do is set up an entire like React project structure for you, like the skeleton for it, and do a lot of things, like add a lot of useful libraries and packages that you would normally have to manually do on your own, and have them all set up and running for you so that you can just focus on the actual React development aspect of it. Some useful things that it's going to provide is you can instantly reload when you make a change in React. So you don't have to refresh even. It'll reflect the changes you make live on your browser. Another thing is it will have a compiler that will allow the JavaScript syntax that you're using to work on older browsers. You'll be able to easily add dependencies on, detect mistakes with ESLint, write tests with Jest, and also like bundle files together to optimize for the browser. So these are not all things that you need to think about in terms of like when you're just like learning and doing a homework, but it's a good environment that it sets up that you would want to use if you have like a full-fledged project in the future that you want to work on. So we're going to start within this sort of project structured environment that Create React App has. And the last part of your homework 8 is going to be just cloning a repository with this skeleton and getting set up with it. And then next class, we're actually going to start coding in it and do more stuff with React. But until then, get the chance to finish homework 8. Again, ask questions. You can stay after right now if you have some. This will give you at least the base JavaScript understanding before we start moving forward with React. And otherwise, finish up milestone 2 by Monday night. Come to office hours and we will dive deeper into React next class. That is it. Everybody have a good weekend. Hopefully you get your milestones done on time and have time to do other things as well. But take care. Bye, Michael. Bye, Christian.
Professor,
Bye, Pranavi. Yeah,
do
what's
you
up?
have office hour today, right? After 5?
Yeah, I have office hours at 3 to 4, and 8 to 9. So come through to those.
Okay, 8 to 9, I think is good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Bye, everyone. Abhishek, it is literally that, but read those documentation to actually see why and what that means. Hussein said, hope we have more YouTube demo. Yeah, okay. We didn't do that today because I wanted you to kind of do it on your own, but I will keep that in mind for future classes. Ian, you might not have access to fetch on the browser, but on Cloud9, it's somehow giving you access. So I think the safest way is just to do window.fetch, and that should work in both cases. Bye, Abhishek. Oh, okay. Are you saying window.fetch doesn't work on Cloud9 now? Okay, window.fetch doesn't work, or it works on Cloud9, but fetch on its own doesn't work on the browser. That could be weird because Cloud9 has its own browser that it's running, and then there's like your regular Chrome or whatever that is running its own browser. So they're two different ones, and they could have different like scopes and different kind of APIs that they're running. As long as it's working on one, that's okay for now. I'll have to look into why this is the case though. I don't know. Yep, for sure. Yeah, come to office hours. Totally. All right. See you later.